Hello everyone, welcome to Vassals of Kingsgrave. The following podcast is about counterfactual history or what if history. It is by Stefan of Boiled Leather Podcast and Stephen from Race to the Iron Throne blog and podcast. It was first published on July 2013 on Stephen's Nerdstream era blog. We thought you might enjoy it. So Stephen and Stefan, let us borrow it.
Hello everyone, this is Stefan Sasse. I am writing the Geschichtsblog in my native German, which concerns itself with all kind of historical matters and maybe where you find this podcast. I'm also writing about all kind of geek stuff in English on the nerdstreamera.blogspot.com. And with me today to conduct this first experiment as a history podcast is...
I'm Stephen Atwell. I'm a PhD student in history at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I also run Race for the Iron Throne, which does sort of Game of Thrones stuff, but from a historical perspective.
So, and we have come together today to share some thoughts on a very special topic of the historical science with you. And this is called Counterfactual History, or sometimes virtual history. And what it does is basically ask a question about what if some event that we know about, for example World War II, hadn't happened or had happened in a different way, and then go on from there, or what would have happened if John F. Kennedy hadn't been assassinated, stuff like that. And
or introduce a completely new variable, like add something in that historically didn't happen. So, what if the eastern seaboard of the United States was actually like 1,000 miles in the middle of the to the east in the middle of the Atlantic, the counterfactual history started as kind of a thought exercise among professional historians about kind of thinking through cause and effect and what the long-term consequences of particular events were, and especially this concept of contingency, that there are turning points in history in which, had things gone slightly differently, the course of history would greatly change. And then it kind of spread outwards from there. I think just because they are kind of fun brain teasers in a way. And science fiction really kind of got a hold of the idea, in part because time travel, works as a really nice vehicle for stories about counterfactual history. You go back and you change the past and what would have happened. There's all kinds of kind of classic counterfactual history. I'm thinking The Man in the High Castle, sometimes by relatively well-known historians or popular writers. But today I think the most popular alternate history or counterfactual history writer is probably Harry Turtledove. Although I kind of think he works as a good example of what not to do in counterfactual history, which is he falls prey to what I call the rubber rails of history, which is he introduces a big change, right? What if the North had lost the Civil War, or what if what if the eastern seaboard of the United States was in the middle of the Atlantic, but then tries to figure out a way to shoehorn back in the major events of world history that people recognize. It kind of gives you a cheat sheet of what to do, and then you can figure out little changes along the way. But it also has kind of a familiarity factor with the audience that, if the Beatles, come back, I recognize that. Whereas if you really do the hard work of counterfactual history, you're often extrapolating into a timeline that people don't kind of immediately recognize.
Yeah, this is something I really recognized during my read of the Harry Turtledove novels of his Southern timeline, where the Confederate States of America won the Civil War and from there on were their own sovereign nation. And this led to an alliance between the then smaller United States of America with the German Empire and Austria-Hungary, which led to an entirely different World War One. And while he recognized that this shift in these alliances would definitely lead to a German victory in this war, and Germany wins World War One in his novels, but he, for some reason, that doesn't change anything. I mean, in his timeline, whether Germany or whether Great Britain and France would have won World War One, it basically doesn't make any difference in Europe. And
Right.
and then happens what you already mentioned in the American continent, where we have basically a repetition of the events that transpired in Europe in between the two
Right.
world wars, in a nearly exact repetition, which is
Yeah.
kind of strange.
It's strange, and it makes bad history, because one of the things that historians spend a lot of time and attention thinking about is cause and effect, and especially the influence of historical forces on events. And this is this idea of the butterfly effect, that even small changes have incredibly important effects down the line. So that if for example, just to take a different example, right, the whole eastern seaboard in the middle of the Atlantic happens. Well, that's going to change the geography of that giant island, which means the agriculture is going to be different. Its relationship to world trade is going to be different. So on and so forth. So the idea that you're going to have, an American Revolution, a the French and Indian Wars, everything from early American history happening more or less at the same time in the same way, but just with a slightly different cast of characters, is bad history. That it's not taking through the it's not thinking through the consequences of different events. And by contrast, I think the best counterfactual histories really do try to think through what the world would look like if a significant change happened. So I'm thinking about, there's this great book, The Years of Rice and Salt. Have you ever read this?
No.
It's by, I'm just looking at the author's name. Anyway, the assumption in the book is basically, what if the Black Death had actually just wiped out Europe completely?
Okay.
And what's good about the series is that it doesn't then try to wind its way back to the rest of of our timeline. That it actually says, okay, all of the kind of cultural and technological and political events of Western Europe just don't happen. So, what are the major currents of world history going to be? Kim Stanley Robinson is the author of that book. And it really kind of looks through a world in which, the major kind of industrializing superpowers are, become India and China in the 18th and 19th century, and that in terms of sort of world religions, it's much more Islam and Confucianism and Buddhism than, say, Christianity. So I think that's kind of an example of how to do it right. Is that you have to, if you're going to make a big change, you have to, as a sort of almost a matter of intellectual integrity, you have to follow through on it.
Yeah, but just the example that I haven't read the books, but the example is an interesting one, because you say the major industrial powers in this world are India and China, which is, if you pose the question, in the absence of Europe, who will become a major economic power? Of course, China and India are the likely candidates. But I find the question more interesting: would there even be an industrial revolution? Because there's always this question: why does the industrial revolution start in England, of all places? And why not in China? At that moment, they are not behind and stuff, you know.
Yeah, exactly. And part of this has to do with, you know, if I think you can get better and better results from counterfactual history if you stay current with the new research in history. So, for example, there's one historian here at UCSB who is a historian of medieval and ancient China, who makes the argument that a lot of the things that we think of as key elements of capitalism, the assembly line, the subdivision of labor within the production process, actually started out in China, and were brought to England by Wedgwood, the guy who makes English China in China. So that he basically argues that the core processes of organization of production already existed outside of Europe, and so in that sense, you can kind of work your way from there, and that's one of the things I think that you can get a lot of value out from counterfactual history is that you can take strange, unexplored little corners of history that people don't pay a lot of attention to, and you can kind of shine a spotlight on them by sort of saying, well, what if this little thing that no one paid attention to was more important, or figuring out a way to have something impressive happen from unforeseen circumstances.
Yeah, that leads me to another question. What is the most productive approach to counterfactual history? Is it exploring little questions, or in comparison, little questions like what would happen, what would have happened if we didn't kill John F. Kennedy, or is it more interesting to look at whole structures that and processes that take place over a century, like what if there was no industrial revolution? And I always have the feeling that counterfactual history is more productive towards an intellectually usable result when you take the processes and structures into account, because it leads you as a historian to ask questions about why does stuff happen, what are the factors that come in here, and it avoids for a historian the usual trap of using your knowledge of the hindsight, your knowledge of what has happened already, to extrapolate back and to explain everything in kind of a giant circle argumentation. So the Industrial Revolution started in England because it started in England. And if I start with counterfactual history and pose the question, what would have happened if there is no Industrial Revolution in England? And then I have to ask, will it break out in any other country? And if yes, in which ones? And I have to dissect it and think about what factors led to the Industrial Revolution, what forced it on its path. And I think we will get more of it asking such questions as to whether or not the assassination of John F. Kennedy would have developed and changed American domestic policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think the virtue of counterfactual history is that it gets us to think more deeply about the historical causes for things. So, in the Industrial Revolution example, if the Industrial Revolution doesn't happen in England, then where would it happen? And that makes you think about, well, what are the things that you need for an Industrial Revolution? And what are the historical... It gets you to think about historical forces. What are the historical forces that drive one location to look for industrialization? Does it have to do with access to natural resources like coal and steel? Coal and iron, or does it have to do with your population, or does it have to do with your the relative importance of agriculture? So things like that for people to consider. I would say that one of the potential weaknesses, and it's not that I think that the smaller questions are bad counterfactual history. In fact, they can be really good counterfactual history, in part because their more confined nature kind of helps to work out the changes more specifically. Yeah, but the weakness is that it does tend to lead people to have a more old-fashioned attitude towards historical theory. The idea, for example, that history is shaped by great men, right?
Yes.
Was is a philosophy of history that hasn't really been accepted by the discipline of history. Academic historians in universities for 100 years or more by this point. But if you look at the people who do counterfactual history, in part because it's a lot of the people who write counterfactual history are amateur historians, or they're professional science fiction writers, or they're not people who've studied the sort of the history of historians. They often do assume that it's all about these great men, and that the way to do alternate history is to ask themselves, well, what would have been different if FDR doesn't get killed, or Napoleon gets hit by a cannonball while in training, or something like that. Whereas which leads to I think this kind of inaccurate picture of how history actually works. That I don't think it's accurate to say that if you change something as simple as, say, Napoleon not being around. Well, there's still going to be a major power struggle on the European continent between revolutionary France and the conservative monarchies. So the idea that you're going to somehow kind of butterfly away the Napoleonic Wars just because there's no Napoleon, I think is kind of mistaken. So one of the things that I think if we want to sort of work on making better counterfactual history, is to have more of an appreciation for the force of historical forces. That there is often unseen and under the surface of day-to-day events, almost imperceptible.
Yeah.
These huge historical forces that shape our lives.
Yeah, I would qualify your statement in a way that while there is definitely the danger, and it is done over and over again, of emphasizing the importance of the great men of history and neglecting other forces as institutions and trends in society, yeah, counterfactual history is an instrument that you have as a historian, and as every instrument, it is inherently neutral. So it doesn't force you into one way of thinking. So
sure.
Yeah, it is a problem. It is definitely a problem, what you just said, and I want to get back at it in a moment. But you can also use counterfactual history as a vaccination just against this view. For example, to come back at the assassination of John F. Kennedy, because if I start to do a counterfactual argument about what would have happened if JFK had lived, and I do it with a little bit of intellectual integrity and am not constructing a hero myth, then I will come down to it wouldn't have changed really much. Because there were so many powers in place, so many players, so many events that were set into motion long before JFK became president, and that continued to exert pressure long after he was dead, and that forced Lyndon B. Johnson on the same path and had forced the hand of Dwight Eisenhower before. And this is all stuff that I can see if I do it with intellectual honesty and integrity. Of course, if I don't do that because my whole interest is to point out just how great a guy JFK was, then this approach will lead me to nowhere. And this is a trap that is not reduced to the professional science fiction writers and the amateur historians, because there is one book I finished reading not long ago. It contains essays by various historians from some British universities, I believe, and it was edited and published by Neil Ferguson, who you might or might not know.
I know he's
Yeah.
technically an academic historian, but God, he's bad at it.
Yeah, Neil Ferguson is a very strange creature of public relations, but let's not talk about that so specifically, because the essays he wrote for the book are basically neglectable. There's much stuff in it from colleagues of his. He just lent his name to the cover, basically.
Right.
And one of the essays in there especially totally falls into the trap of having a set of ideas that the author is convinced of, and he uses the counterfactual debate just to force this argument on us over and over and over again, even if he hasn't really have any arguments. And the essay was about what would have happened if Hitler had invaded Great Britain in World War II. And he is so convinced of the greatness of the British people, and he wants to show just how Great Britain kicks ass, that he concludes that even if Hitler had invaded, the Britons would have fought him in a guerrilla warfare down to the last man. And he
that's a particularly bad argument, because one, I mean, that probably wouldn't have worked even if it had happened. I mean, there were guerrilla wars fought against the German army in that war. They weren't always successful.
No, not really.
And also, the historical evidence is more along the lines that, had Operation Sea Lion actually been attempted, that the failure, it would have failed on the water. Not, it probably never would have gotten, across the channel. But this is a problem that people have particular access, and this is where, more on the amateur side, you do get some worrying trends, in part because, people, when you have alternate history, it's a vehicle for people to explore, among other things, their dissatisfaction with the status quo.
Yeah.
Right? You don't ask, if you like something that's happened, right? You're less inclined to ask, well, what if it didn't happen? Versus, the other way around. So one of the things that often pops up, the Civil War is a huge trope within alternate history, within counterfactual history.
Yeah.
And, for a lot of different reasons. But, there is this, fringe element within those circles who are people who really want the Confederacy to have won the Civil War, who are, neo-Confederates and believe in, that slavery was a good thing. And the problem is that, and this is where a lot of bad history gets used in order to do this. So one of the tropes that's often used, for example, is what if Lincoln hadn't been assassinated, right?
Yeah, he would have rocked Reconstruction, of course.
Yeah, exactly. That's the argument that's used. But the theory behind that argument is that radical Reconstruction is what made everything bad. That actually attempting to give black people in the South civil rights was what made Reconstruction bad. Well, no one in the academy actually believes that anymore. We've had 50 years of research that shows, well, no, the reason that there were problems with with Reconstruction had more to do with the opposite, that there was not enough of an attempt to actually change things on the ground, that, when, the terrorist violence started up against former slaves, that the federal government was not active enough. So, you see, so you see sometimes within counterfactual history circles, these kind of discredited theories of history lurking around, in part because people want to
use them politically.
Use them politically, or express their dissatisfaction with the status quo in many different ways. I mean, the JFK being a great guy example, right, is, I think, a little bit less of a contentious example than the Civil War. It's more about, well, if you're a liberal Democrat and you're not particularly enthused with, what happened in American politics after 1968, then you can kind of, use the dream of JFK still being alive to kind of imagine a world in which, your beliefs carry the day, and that makes you feel better. Well, the problem is that works for everyone's political beliefs, and sometimes those are, some are more palatable than others. A slightly different topic that I wanted to kind of take up here is the idea of kind of turning points and continuity versus discontinuity, because one of the things that I do think we can learn a lot from counterfactual history is thinking about turning points in history more carefully, and there's this famous phrase that's used a lot. It originated from the study of the revolutions of 1848 about turning points in history where history failed to turn, where historians can point to all kinds of forces that seem to be leading to a particular outcome, and then that outcome doesn't happen quite. And I think one of the nice things that alternate history can do is to sort of say, well, okay, what if history actually had turned at those points? Or vice versa, like, why is it that we consider certain things to be inevitable, like, say, the French Revolution? Isn't it possible that that could have been a turning point at which history failed to turn? And, make us reconsider our assumptions about, the inevitability of certain historical outcomes.
Yeah, I find this very interesting, and that is what I mean when I say counterfactual history can really be a stimulant for the debate and for questioning assumptions we made, like the French Revolution is inevitable. Why exactly is it? Or the American Civil War was inevitable at that point. Yes, so why? Explain it to me. And if I tweak this little variable, it just doesn't happen anymore, so you can't really say it was inevitable. And all that stuff like that. And this leads to really asking about the forces and the reasons behind stuff, and inevitably also leads us away from personification, which is an added bonus, because as you already mentioned, it is not exactly state of the art in the historical science anymore. And it doesn't really explain much stuff. It builds a very compelling narrative most of the time, but it really doesn't help you understanding. You brought up the example of Napoleon. If he hadn't tried to conquer the whole of Europe, which he ultimately failed to do anyway. So what would have happened if the French, say, would have just conquered the area west of the Rhine and then, well, made peace of some kind? Would it have changed that much? What would it have changed? Yeah, and these questions are really, really interesting, and they get rarely asked. And I think many historians really don't like counterfactual history, because
it doesn't have a great reputation.
No, it doesn't, and it has it for reasons. As I mentioned earlier, this book that I read by these British historians that was edited by Ferguson, it had really much of this stuff. About half the essays were simply really, really bad. And the real problem with counterfactual history is you can state pretty much everything, because everything that you say rests on assumptions you make that cannot be proven or disproven. You just have to accept them on the merit of plausibility. You can say it sounds right, and there are some arguments supporting this assumption, or there are arguments that contradict the assumption, but you can't really determine something either way. It is, in large, of course, the problem of the whole historical science, but in
Yeah.
counterfactual history, it's magnified.
Yeah,
And
yeah, I would agree. The fact that we can't run experiments, really, I mean, it's partly why history is usually considered one of the humanities as opposed to a social science. Is that up until we invent some form of time travel, and can create alternate timelines and see what happens. There is a limit to what you can do with alternate history, which is, I think, what makes it a fun intellectual exercise, a good jumping off point. But I think there's a reason why it's not like a sub-discipline within history, that
yes,
people don't get degrees in counterfactual history, because there's a limit to what you can do with it. And at the same time, though, I would say I think you can do counterfactual history better if you take the effort to learn your historical methods,
yes,
and really take them seriously. So one of the things that often happens in counterfactual history is you notice that people can construct timelines where huge events are always happening. Huge world historical events are constantly happening, in part because if you're writing this as a hobby, you don't want to write about things not happening. You don't want to write about, things that are boring. Well, the sad reality of history is that there are huge stretches of history in which very little changes, in which there is what we call continuity. And moments of discontinuity, where things suddenly change, part of the reason that they're interesting for historians is that they're pretty rare. If you look at, the example springing to my mind is, medieval Europe. You can look at particular localities where very little seems to change over hundreds and hundreds of years, and then all of a sudden, huge sweeping things happen. Well, if you're doing counterfactual history, you need to kind of respect that a little bit. That if that instead of just changing everything because you can change everything, sometimes you need to kind of work through the breathing spaces of history, if you know what I mean.
yeah. I also want to come back on the question of popularity of counterfactual history within the academics, because just as a little insight, while counterfactual history is pretty unpopular within the academics of history everywhere, here in Germany it is especially unpopular, because German historians tend to overemphasize, or let's say emphasize, which is less judgmental, tend to emphasize the society structures in society, these larger forces that work over decades, because we had, quite frankly, some very bad experiences with personalized history. Before
Right.
before World War II, German history was all about the great people. And
Right.
nothing else really, and that changed drastically after we lost World War II. And so,
Right. Right.
there is this one thing, this one break in continuity, where we have it in the academics. But it is also, and that is the second part of the observation I want to make, virtual history is dangerous. It is really, really dangerous if the wrong people attempted it. If we historians do it, and it stays confined to the academic debate, you can at the outmost ruin your reputation as a scientist, which is sad for
Mm.
you, but which doesn't affect the world at large. But if people with power in their hands start
Yeah.
meddling with counterfactual history, they can happen really, really bad stuff. And there are certain periods in our recent history where that happened. In Germany, we have the whole World War II and parts of World War One, II are caused directly by an obsession of the people in charge with counterfactual scenarios.
Right.
And the Cuban Missile Crisis, to bring an American example, is also one that broke out almost only because the Kennedys and their immediate advisors were obsessed with counterfactuals about the Munich Treaty. And so if you are thinking about counterfactual history as something that can guide you in important real-world decisions, you are trotting in a terrain that is really so dangerous that I can only scream at you, stay away from it. It is stuff that historians can use to get some insight. It is fun to do in fantasy and science fiction literature, but if you think that it can help you to ease real-world decisions, you are on track to disaster. And I don't know of any example where it was done successfully.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the difficult... I think we're actually stretching into a slightly different topic here, which is what are the lessons of history, right?
Yeah.
How if history actually was a social science, it would be all about applying lessons of history to guide us in the future so that we don't make the same mistakes twice. But, one of the things that back in the day that one of my professors taught me was he said, there are no lessons of history because the problem is we're always learning the wrong lessons.
Yes.
And we're applying them incorrectly. That, after World War II, everyone's mental example was Munich. Well, at Munich, everyone's mental example was Versailles, and at Versailles, everyone's mental example was, keep going backwards. And it's kind of this historical tragedy of, everyone preparing for the last historical epoch. And, that I think teaches us a certain limitation, which is that the future is not the past. That, you can't just say, because something happened this way in the past, it'll happen this way in the future. Where I do think that, from selfish, from entirely selfish perspective, I do think that the way in which history can be useful in terms of policy, because I do policy history, is in examining unexplored alternatives that, and this is not so much in kind of world historical senses of, what if we hadn't fought, what if we'd fought at Munich or something. It's more about public policy that, I study public policy, and one of the things that comes up a lot in policy history is that policy alternatives, that have been used in the past are sometimes dropped for reasons that have very little, if anything, to do with their actual success or failure, or their efficiency as mechanisms for achieving certain options.
Yes.
But again, this is something where you don't want people to go crazy, that you want, you want kind of the sober academic perspective to kind of work through things and kind of really look and say, well, okay, did this work or did this not work, and why particularly was this abandoned, and what would this look like if we tried it again today, as opposed to just sort of saying, well, we did this, and so let's try it again, and I think one of the kind of examples that you can sort of think about this is the recent popularity of the gold standard in like fringe politics today.
Yeah.
Right. Especially in the United States. On the right. Because we used to do this and things were better back in the day, and therefore we should go back to using the gold standard. Well, if you take a more sober academic approach to the gold standard, whether you do it as an economist or you do it as a historian, there's huge problems with the gold standard, which would make using it today disastrous. So you have to kind of, you have to be careful with that kind of stuff, and not kind of just say, it's a fallacy of historical thinking, this golden age thinking, that the past was always better than the present. Well, usually, and I say this as someone who studies the past for a living, I'm very glad to be living in the present.
Oh, yes.
I like indoor plumbing and antibiotics and all that good stuff. It's one of the reasons why, as much as a fan I am of the Song of Ice and Fire series, that I can't understand when people say, oh man, wouldn't it be cool to live in Westeros?
Oh, never.
Things were so much better then. And I'm like, no, everyone thinks that because they think they'll be, a king or a princess or something.
And be healthy all the time.
Yeah, and be healthy all the time. Whereas, like, in part because of, my own understanding of my own family's history, I'm like, no, I would be a peasant. I would be owned by somebody. I'd maybe live to 45, and I'd probably die, of some horrific disease that could be cured by, a 10-cent, antibiotic.
Yeah.
I'm really, I don't ever want to go back. I'd love to visit, but I wouldn't want to live there.
Yeah, I'm totally feeling you there. This kind of nostalgia is really a strange thing, but most amateurs who are concerned with history fall in this trap of this nostalgia thing, and it is also constantly exploited for political reasons. I mean, the gold standard is just one example of fringe politics, as you just said, but there is so much more going on. Just think of liberals who are referencing FDR all the time, and to a lesser extent the Great Society of Lyndon B. Johnson. We have the same thing here in Germany, where people are all the time referencing the so-called Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that happened after World War II, and where we had yearly growth rates of about 10%, of course, after a big war where the whole land was reduced to rubble, by the way. But people are invoking this all the time as an example of life was simple and good back then, and we hated migrants, and we suppressed women and all that stuff that isn't really talked about. They just look at a feeling that wasn't even felt back then, and apply their own hopes and dreams on it. I just read this proverb some time ago that liberals want to work in the 50s and conservatives want to go home there. But neither of them wants both.
That's good. That's good. Yeah, I mean, I think, the major problem with the golden age thinking, as you say, is that it never really was true at the time. I mean, I'm old enough, unfortunately, that I can remember the 90s pretty well, right? And people talk a lot about these days, the
Clinton.
economy was so much better in the 90s under Clinton, and, everything's terrible now. Well, I remember that things weren't actually as great as they seemed in the 90s. That, that the economic prosperity of that time wasn't as widespread as people think it is, and, rested ultimately on some really insecure foundations. So, I would like something better than that, please. If we're going to have an economic recovery, let's have an economic recovery that, is genuine, as opposed to, resting entirely on this, gigantic bubble of credit. But the flip side of that is, I think what that kind of thinking shows you is that is people's priorities and values. So, the bit about liberals want to work in the 50s, conservatives want to go home in the 50s. Well, part of what that tells you is that, when we say that liberals want a more egalitarian economic structure, but are content with the cultural and social progress that's been made since then. That no one's saying, liberals don't say that they want a return to the days when women weren't in the workforce, and there were massive there were massive legal barriers to minorities, etc., etc. Whereas conservatives clearly are more kind of concerned about those social changes. The one area of this kind of nostalgia that we haven't really talked about as much is what you could call material nostalgia. If you think about the popularity of historical shows like Mad Men,
Yes.
I think there's a lot of people who, not for 1 second would they want to actually live in the 1950s, but they would really like to be able to dress like they lived in the 1950s and not be made fun of, or they have nostalgia about the music or the cars or stuff like that. Which I think that's far less harmful. If people want to get nostalgic about classic cars, that doesn't really. I don't think that poses any problems.
Yeah. I just want to revisit one point about counterfactual history because it is a bit funny, really, that the most popular form of counterfactual history is the one that concerns with very, very small details in a very small field of history, and I'm talking about battles. Everyone, when battles are concerned, everyone becomes a historian. Yeah, you have I don't know, you have the Battle of Gettysburg, and if Lee just would have done that, then he would have won. And then the importance of any particular battle is blown out of proportions, because if you go through the effort of thinking about how a particular battle could have been won, you might as well declare it the turning point of a war, and of course a war in and of itself is a turning point, and so on. And this obsession with battles and how they might have played out differently is a really interesting one, and it is fairly popular. I don't know how it is in the United States, but here in Germany at least, I always hear people talking, if they talk about history, it is almost always battles, and in the case of battles, of course, World War II. And
yeah, I mean, if you go into a big bookstore, and you go into the history section, you'll see easily twice as many shelves dedicated to military history as you do to general historical topics, and it really is a divergence between the academy and popular culture, in that military history will sell. Now, granted, I think it sells to a particular audience. I mean, the extent to which it is generally popular, or I think is can be a little bit exaggerated. But the the joke that's often told in history departments is that if you want to get rich, what you do is you write a book either about the Civil War, World War II, or Lincoln.
Yep.
And that's how you make your money. And
here you can only write about World War II.
Yeah. So that's kind of the sort of the interesting divergence. And I think there's certain things that I think explain why that is. I mean, for this, just to focus on counterfactual history for the moment, the nice thing about wars and battles is that they're fairly discrete events, and they involve variables that can be listed fairly easily, and they're if you study military strategy, you can pick up at least the rudiments easily enough that you can kind of start to have an opinion about how different actions would have had different outcomes on battles, and battles on wars, and wars on everything else. Yeah, that's all I got. Sorry, I completely forgot where I was going with that.
No problem. I remember where I was going, because this leads me back to this argument that I made before about how dangerous counterfactual history can become, because the obsession with trying to find out what would have to be different about a certain battle in order to everything else going differently is in large part what was a predominant mindset in at least the German military between World War One and World War Two, and in many of the German elites as well. And it was for a very long time a German obsession to think about battles and let's put that in quotation marks, the perfect battle strategy. Germans were obsessed with finding the perfect battle, and they always believed that if they just did it right, forced one decisive battle that they executed perfectly, then they would win everything. And
Sure.
this is
And you see that there's an American equivalent to that. There's a famous quote by Faulkner about Gettysburg, where he says, for every Southern boy, and he means every Southern white boy, there is forever that moment at Gettysburg where Pickett's charge had not yet happened, and you can imagine it going another way. So, this obsession about battles has this political significance.
Yes, but the real question is, because people always tend to assume that when they have made a perfect battle, that then everything else will come out differently too. For example, let's say Pickett's charge doesn't happen that way, or is thwarted, or whatever, and the Confederates win at the Battle of Gettysburg. Would they have won the Civil War? Is pretty unlikely. Or imagine the Germans not losing at Stalingrad. Who the fuck cares? They would have lost. They would have lost the war anyway, because what broke the Germans' neck in World War II wasn't a particular battle, but the setup that led to these battles. There are facts that you have to take into account, like from the famed German Tiger tanks, which so many people like to obsess about. They were built about 5,000, and the Russians built 60,000 T-34. The Americans built 30,000 Shermans, and you can win as many decisive battles as you like. You simply can't win against a force like that. And
I think that points to one of the kind of hidden ideologies of counterfactual history, which is this this kind of romanticism. Right, a desire for the
clean thing?
Yeah, for the clean thing, or the more individualistic thing to happen, or the more exciting thing to happen, as opposed to the more dull reality of everyday life. And it's part of the reason why, you rarely see kind of, you don't see a whole lot of economic history counterfactuals. You don't see a whole lot of demographic history counterfactuals. You don't see a lot of, counterfactuals of culture or women's culture, because, those point to the more, some of the realities and truths of our lives that
they are uncomfortable. Really uncomfortable.
For some people.
Yeah, for most. I mean, it is really hard to think about, for example, what would have happened if we didn't have the women's right movement, for example, because you have to question beliefs you hold dear. Because you have to question your whole way of life, as opposed to Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. That is a really easy overlooked affair. You can have all the variables before you, or at least pretend to have all the variables, and it feels confided into a certain space. You can get a grasp of it, and the other things are really hard to think about. You need time. It is nothing you can discuss in about 10 minutes,
Or in about 50 minutes, as our case is.
Yes.
All right, so I gotta get going. It was a really fun discussion.
Yes, absolutely. We should repeat it at some point.
Absolutely. Okay, see you around.
Yeah, see you. Bye.